The unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see it and hear it, remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. I have to apologize for my weenie voice that some people can't hear. And I will try to speak up, speak slowly. And, I have to also apologize for not being able to cover most of the sutra because there's just too much here. And I'm hoping that it will inspire you to read all of this because it has such incredibly wonderful teaching, and it's been an enormous help to me, my own personal practice. But I do want to briefly go through the 4 clear and definitive instructions on purity, which is simply an introduction to the precepts. Since this is primarily a dialogue between the Buddha and Ananda, who is a monk, his cousin, these references to the precepts are the 4 precepts that are the most serious things for a monk to break. Because if a monk breaks any one of these precepts, he would be excluded from the monastic assembly. These are called the parajika offenses. Basically, it's sexual desire, killing, stealing, and making false claims, i.e. lying. And for a monk to have sex or to kill anything or steal even small things or to claim that they are enlightened when they're not, these are the things that would cause their exclusion from the monastic sangha. And this is why the Buddha uttered the Surangama litany, was to try to prevent Ananda from breaking one of these precepts. Dogen has this beautiful saying about the precepts. It's, within these precepts dwell the Buddhas, enfolding all things within their unparalleled wisdom. There is no subject or object for any who dwell herein. All things, earth, trees, wooden posts, bricks, and stones, become Buddhas once these precepts have been accepted. From these precepts come forth such a wind and fire that all are driven into enlightenment when the flames are fanned by the Buddha's influence. Well, the Buddha is fanning the flames here of the precepts. He's trying to point out the fact that these precepts are inseparable from the behavior of a Buddha. The deepest explanation of the precepts that I have heard is Reverend Master Yu Kinet's commentary from her experience in 1976, where she asked very deeply what the meaning of each of these precepts was. And I wholeheartedly recommend that you study them deeply, study her commentary. My own understanding is that they are not just rules for moral behavior. They represent the actions of a Buddha. And our commitment to them plays a major part in our spiritual growth and development. They are not just prohibitions against causing harm. Not killing, for example, arises out of reverence for all life. Not stealing comes from a recognition of our spiritual wholeness to which nothing real can be added. Not lying comes from a deep commitment to realize the truth. Refraining from the misuse of sexuality comes out of giving up all of our coveting, all of our desires. Whatever that desire is, it's those habits of acting out of greed, whether it's for sex or food or alcohol or money or whatever the coveting is, those habits arise out of the major habit of the clinging to an idea of self. This is where you have to dissolve the whole idea of subject and object. This is why he's talking about turning the senses inward. All of us, what we truly desire is to be at peace. Acting on these karmically conditioned habits are the things that leave us without peace. The same with alcohol, or selling the wine of delusion has to do with giving up this delusion of self. This involvement with perceived objects. Not being critical of others comes out of seeing the Buddha nature in all things. Relinquishing pride and inadequacy, which are basically just the two sides of the same coin, comes from not knowing our spiritual wholeness and not seeing it in everything. Not being angry comes out of understanding what loving kindness is about. It's the non-aversion. It's all acceptance. It's the non-insisting on the truth. And not defaming the three treasures comes out of our reverence and devotion to the practices and the beings who have put an end to suffering, to those who know the highest truth. We must see these precepts as simply pointing to our highest spiritual aspiration. It is as the Buddha says, this is a quote, "When I have explained the Vinaya, which is the monastic precepts, you have often heard me speak of three elements of spiritual practice. Precepts, which require us to guard and focus the mind. Samadhi, or meditation, which arises from following the precepts. And wisdom, which appears out of samadhi. These are the three practices that put an end to outflows." This is again, what I mentioned before about the Eightfold Path. Wisdom, which is right understanding and right thought, or right intention. That's the prajna. The precepts are right speech, right action, and right livelihood. That's sila. And meditation is jhana, or samadhi, is right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So understand that these four precepts here mentioned are really meant to apply to all the precepts. And we take them differently as lay people than we take them as monks, but it's the same intention. Sections 8, 9, and 10 are things that I just don't have the time to go over. Part 8 is on the establishing a place for awakening, and the Surangama mantra or litany, the powers of the mantra, and these endless vows of beings who will protect you if you devote yourself to this practice. And again, don't look outside for all those for protection. You have millions of protective beings right inside you. Chapter 9 is on the levels of being. Coming into the world into being of the world of illusion has caused many 12 classes of beings, 3 gradual steps, 57 stages to the Bodhisattva's path. And it also has a section on the naming of this discourse. And then it goes through the 6 worlds, the hells, the ghosts, the hungry ghosts, animals, humans. And the Chinese have put in here ascetic masters, which, because of the Chinese culture of having Taoist immortals, they've added those in here too. And the destiny of the gods who are in heaven, and Asuras, and how these 7 destinies are the results of karma. Chapter 10 is on the 50 demonic states. And these are the dangers that may arise with advanced practice. And those are broken up into those associated with the aggregate of form, those associated with the aggregate of sense perception, those associated with the aggregate of cognition, and the 10 demonic states associated with the aggregate of mental formations, and those associated with the aggregate of consciousness. And then there's a discussion on the 5 aggregates arising from delusion and the merits of the teaching of the Surangama Dharma. And I hope all of you will take advantage of this. Any of you that have borrowed copies of the Buddhist Text Society's, Text Translation Society's wonderful book here, you're welcome to keep those books if you are willing to treat them with respect and to study them and use them. If you're not going to do that, and if you think you've had enough of the Surangama this week and want to give us back those books, you can. But if you can cherish them and read them and use them, you're welcome to have them. They were a wonderful gift. I want to talk briefly about kind of a review of what this scripture is teaching us. The most important part of being here this week is that you got to recite the litany, do the meditation, and even if you couldn't hear the talks, you had to sit there and listen, which is even more important. And if all you heard was silence, well, that was even better. The Buddha rarely stepped in to interfere with anybody's training. But Ananda, although he had not trained his mind and had this enormous intellectual mind, Ananda, with that intellectual mind, also has the Buddha nature. And it was the source of that memory that allows us to have these scriptures today. It just means that his strength and his weaknesses were in the same place. And all of us here can associate very much with Ananda because we mostly have overeducated intellectual minds. And ourselves, these minds are what we hold on to as ourself. And this is the mind that we have to give up. So the Buddha, in talking to Ananda, and the dialogue that goes on between the two of them it's one of the most beautiful dialogues that I've ever read, because it shows this incredible patience and loving kindness that the Buddha has, trying his best to help Ananda. And even though Ananda sometimes argues with him and doesn't really want to do the work, he eventually does the work. And the Buddha is just incredibly kind, and Ananda is incredibly sincere, and he really wants to do this. It's just that he has to overcome these karmic habits. And this is exactly what we have to do. Because it isn't enough just to be sincere. We really have to do the work. So this scripture is telling us the difference between the mind that we perceive through sense objects in the mind and sense objects in the body, and this Buddha mind, which is the unborn, undying mind. And this second chapter, we're trying to show that this visual awareness is a beautifully detailed description. It goes through 12 things here to show that it's the mind that sees and not the eyes. That the blind man can still see darkness. Patrick's reference to Jacques Luziran, who went blind but still had incredible powers of sight. This was what happened to Anuruddha, who was one of the Buddha's disciples, who the Buddha chided him for being lazy. He was sleeping too much. And he was so ashamed of himself that he stayed up for 7 days and 7 nights meditating with his eyes open, and he went blind as a result of the exertion of his mental strain and physical strain. But he got the power of spiritual insight. So at the end, when the Buddha was dying, it was Anuruddha who could visit everybody's minds and tell the Buddha that nobody here had any doubts. So in the process of losing his sight, he gained incredible insight. And that insight is infinitely more important. But it still doesn't mean that you should go around staying awake for 7 days and losing your sight. This is not what's being recommended. But the Buddha is trying to point out that the mind, this awareness, this Buddha mind is what sees. Visual awareness, the awareness does not move. The awareness does not perish. Visual awareness is not lost. The true nature of visual awareness is not lost. This is what continues from life to life. It's not dependent on conditions. It's not a perceived object. It has neither shape nor extent. It's both separate and non-separate from objects. It arises neither on its own nor from causes. But we distort this visual awareness through karma, through our individual likes and dislikes, the things that are slant on how it is that we perceive things through the filter of our old karma. Visual awareness exists neither through inhering nor conjoining. That means that it's not a thing that is inherent. It just is. And it's not conjoined. It doesn't mean have to combine with anything. The visual awareness is just our awareness is just another name for the Buddha mind. And then he talks about the womb of the Tathagata, or the matrix of the thus come one, as this beautiful translation talks about it. And this is new information for those who had trained before in searching for the Arhat ideal. Because what he's explaining is, if you look up at the night sky, all of the universe is held within this stillness, this emptiness of space. Everything comes out of that emptiness. And at the same time, even though delusion can arise out of the womb of the Tathagata, it's not part of that delusion. The delusion is not the womb of the Tathagata. The delusion is not the Buddha nature. All the faculties arise out of the Buddha, out of the matrix of the thus come one, out of the womb of the Tathagata. The 12 sights, the ear faculties and their objects, all the sense faculties and their objects, the 18 constituents, all the consciousnesses that arise out of this contact of the senses with their object. All of these are arising out of the womb of the Tathagata. The 7 primary elements: earth, fire, water, wind, space, awareness, consciousness. And Ananda is smart enough to realize that this ground is shifting here, and that he makes this bodhisattva vow at the end of that. Because instead of trying to get out of this difficult situation of being born and coming back again, it's the going into that situation and doing our training for the benefit of all beings. And the explanation here of the coming into being of the world of illusion because of adding an understanding to this inherent enlightenment. It's a really wonderful way of understanding, actually, how all of this stuff comes out because of our tension of the mind. We do not have to understand. Prajna is what comes before knowledge. The Buddha's enlightenment is irreversible. There's a lovely phrase in here that I didn't read, but it's a quote that Dogen uses, that wood does not become wood again after it has turned to ashes. That he has burned away all his involvement with the illusion of a self. And those ashes are not going to turn again into a lump of wood. But until we get to that place, we still have to be very careful, even on the later stages of training. We can still be grabbed by our old karma. So we have to realize that the commitment to keep on training, no matter how deeply you've gone into that, is one of the most important teachings of this scripture. In the parable of Yajnadatta, this is a wonderful example of how it is that we cling to an illusion and turn it into delusion. Yajnadatta looked in the mirror and he saw this very nice face and he was enraptured by it, and he looked at it and he didn't recognize himself. So he went running around thinking it had lost his head. Well, we spend many, many lifetimes running around trying to prop up this illusion of a self. And we create all sorts of suffering in the process. And letting go of that one simple delusion, which has no basis in reality, it's just a misperception. It's like Yajnadatta, you can't give him his head back because he hasn't lost it. You haven't lost your Buddha nature, you just don't recognize it. And we're all trying to hold on to this illusion of a self here. And since it doesn't exist, we create a lot of tension trying to create it. And these are the 5 layers of turbidity. The turbidity of time, of beings, of lifetimes, all these perceptions. These are the stirring up of the mud that beclouds that clear water of the Buddha nature. So the Buddha is telling us to choose one faculty in order to liberate all 6. And he uses the sound of the bell to show people that there's a difference between hearing and sound. The bell can ring and you can hear it. The bell cannot ring and your hearing is still there. It hasn't disappeared. Your ability to hear, your ability to see, to know, to understand is this inherent awareness. It is not dependent upon these external things. And it's these external things as we've tied ourselves up in knots. And we can untie those knots by going in, choosing one of these 6 senses, and starting to unravel these knots. And so 25 sages are called upon to speak about their own enlightenment. And each one uses one of the senses, an object of sense, the cognition that arises from that. That's 18 of them. And then the others are using one of the elements: earth, fire, water, wind, space, awareness, or consciousness. And Manjushri then is called upon to say which is the best for Ananda and those in the Dharma ending age. And Manjushri recommends the turning of the hearing inward, because that's what Avalokiteshvara used, that's what he used, that's what Samantabhadra used. He says this is the easiest one. But it's that, what Dogen calls, turning the stream of compassion within and giving up both knowledge and its recognition. The knowledge creates a sense of pride, a sense of I. There's a sense of self that knows something. That prajna is the wisdom and the compassion that exists within this pure awareness before there's been a self that wants to understand and hold on to an understanding of anything. And the beauty of this practice is that the training is enlightenment. You do not have to understand anything. You just have to do the work. Training your mind. Because this is what Ananda hadn't done. And so he was still subject to being pulled away by his senses. Because he wasn't looking inward. The irony of his experience is that the courtesan, the Matangi woman who never intended to undertake a spiritual cultivation, heard the Surangama litany and has now become an arhat. And even before Ananda, who takes another 20 years after the Buddha's death to become an arhat, she is so moved by the teaching that she gets on with it right away. One of the major themes throughout the sutra is that awareness does not come from the eyes, ears, noses, tongues, bodies, or brains. It comes from an awareness that does not die and is not born. By focusing on silence, we are focusing on the Buddha mind. Mahastama Prapta talked about the awareness of the Buddha. His consciousness was focused on understanding the Buddha, and this is what allowed him to become enlightened. By listening to silence or just sitting with no deliberate thought, you are focusing on the eternal. It is the doorway into the infinite. We need to withdraw our attention from the magnetic pull of the senses to their external objects. The mind that is at peace can be found by loosening the grip on this karmically conditioned desires and aversions to the senses and to their objects. It's a question of the attachments to these illusions. Just as Yajnadatta was enraptured by his image in the mirror, we have to recognize that we too are enraptured by the delusion of self. And this is the source of our suffering. And meditating, you're training your mind to loosen the grip on this attachment and seek a true refuge within that stillness. And as Avalokiteshvara points out, the stiller it gets, the farther you need to go. Sound can disappear. Silence can disappear. Whatever arises out of that has to disappear. The emptiness can come, and the emptiness has to be emptied. And then that has to be emptied. And his consciousness, united with both the infinite compassion of this pure awareness and with the mind of all beings who experience suffering. It's by seeing people as separate beings and not seeing them as fundamentally the Buddha that we see injustice or suffering. If there are no separate beings, then what is all this stuff happening? These catfights and wars and everything else that is unhappy and unpleasant. Down to just basically not being happy with what you got for breakfast. Well, that's pretty difficult around here. The suffering exists because of the illusion of separate beings. If everything is happening within the womb of the Tathagata, and the Tathagata is big enough to hold the delusions and the suffering of all beings, who is it that suffers? We are not separate or apart from that Buddha nature. And it is only a question of doing this fine-tuning adjustment of turning that sense inward and really looking for that refuge in the place where you can actually find it. And it's only when we accept fully our responsibility for being able to do this and commit ourselves completely to doing so that we can do this. All of eternity is right there in that stillness. When the Arhats talk about seeing their lives with being as disciples of Buddhas in vast eons ago, it's because that's right there in the present moment. When they first put up the Hubble telescope, they were getting light from a star that was so far away that star didn't exist anymore. The light was still there. All of that eternity can be found within the stillness if we let go of the self. We can get in touch with that which has no limits. As Koho Senji said, if you can let go of give up something as small as the self, you can know something as great as the universe. As Reverend Master Ji put it, the real gift is getting rid of something you never wanted anyway. But that generosity has to come. Both in the physical world, we have to learn to be generous. And in the spiritual world, we have to let go of our suffering. The great assembly beheld this with awe, unable to hold on to their fears and desires. They sought the Buddha's pity and aid. In other words, if we can loosen our grip here, we can get that which is real. But our grip is firmly holding on to this idea of a self. And only each of us individually can let go of that if we choose. And you'll get endless lifetimes of opportunities to do this. But take advantage of the one you got now. It may not come again in this form for a while. So this is why it's just so important to realize the incredible gift that we've been given by having the good karma to be reborn as human beings and being able to hear the Buddha's teaching. And one of the most wonderful parts about the scripture is this actual conversation that the Buddha is having with Ananda, with Purna, Maitreya Yanaputra, with King Prasanajit, and basically with asking the help of all these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to describe how they did it. You know, his stepping back and let everybody else explain how they succeeded. Because his success is for the benefit of all beings. The Buddha's enlightenment is in fact the enlightenment of all beings because he shows us that all of us have this same ability. We have to learn what it is that he did and do it for ourselves. He can show us what kind of mistakes we're making, and that which sees the error is not itself in error. So all we have to do is shift that perspective to look at our errors and understand them. If you can understand them, you can let them go. Because you'll be in the position of the Buddha, who sees this is not the way to put an end to suffering. Ajnata Kundina was the first to get enlightenment, and all he had to do was realize that that image of the visitor and the host, the dust and the air, were telling him about his relationship with his illusions. The Buddha said there's no need to do this through great ascetic practices. But you have to train the mind. The real gift of a retreat like this is that you get to do the meditation as well as the ceremonies, the working meditation, and the opportunity to see that everything you do throughout the day is an expression of your spiritual life. And every time that you can see the mind is wandering as you're wandering from place to place and you're not thinking about where you were walking, you may just stumble upon that little poison thorn, and it may be the exact thing you need to wake you up. But when you run across those little poison thorns, use them. Use them to help wake you up. No matter what the difficulty is, it too comes out of the womb of the Tathagata. Everything can be used to help us if we change our perspective on it. If we see that everything here is there to teach us something. And it's changing our minds, doing this slight little shift in this kaleidoscope, to put those in perspective so that we're willing to learn from them. And that willingness to learn doesn't mean that we end up with knowledge. It means we let go of the knowledge and get comfortable with the fact that there's ignorance here, and learn how to work within that ignorance and within our limitations. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be somebody else. You just have to be the best you can be. And that is a really tall order. Because it means looking at all the places where we're maybe not doing our best. Like, I got to learn to speak up. But we all have to learn to listen. And this learning to listen is an ongoing, deepening process, and you don't even need your ears to do this. Just use what you got inside. And if all you can do is hear silence, well, get comfortable with that. And if you can't yet hear silence, then work on it. Just gently, compassionately, keep working on it, even if it lasts only a half a second. Keep working on just bringing your mind back to that place of stillness. The habits of our talking mind, they're just habits. They don't have to be gotten rid of. We just have to change very subtly where we focus our attention. And we have to let go of the emotionality that goes along with our old karma. We don't have to believe in these emotional reactions. We can let them happen, we can experience them, and we can let them go. But we don't have to believe that there is anything to the idea that the self is actually threatened. Of course it's threatened because it's an illusion. Everything actually threatens it. And to leap beyond all fear is to know that heart of compassion. If you'll notice in the scripture of great wisdom, it's Avalokiteshvara who understands the emptiness of form. It's through compassion that we can know wisdom. The emptiness of the form comes from our willingness to find that very deep compassion within us that is not moved And we'll leap beyond fear and desire and enticements and all the rest of it. And this is what is being offered to us, the great present of the present moment, the gift of the eternal moment. The gift of the eternal is right there within your heart and mind. And all we have to do is really just open ourselves up to that. And yes, Beth, that's all. But you have to keep doing it. You keep doing it. And it is all there, and it is all empty. That emptiness is where you find that infinite love and compassion and wisdom. May you all be successful and never give up. However innumerable beings may be, I vow to save them all. However inexhaustible the passions may be, I vow to transform them all. However limitless the Dharma may be, I vow to comprehend it completely. However infinite the Buddha's truth is, I vow to realize it. Homage to the Buddha. Homage to the Dharma. Homage to the Sangha.